and welcome to another episode of the CompileSwift podcast. I'm your host, Peter Whittam. In this podcast, we talk about everything related to Apple platforms and Apple development, including macOS, iOS, iPadOS, watchOS, tvOS, and any other OS they've invented this week. So with that, let's get on with the show. This time around, I want to talk a little bit about our approach to designing and building applications, because I think over recent years, it's taken a change of direction. I think that now we have to approach things from a different viewpoint. Previously, apps were very much designed for particular platforms, or we had a platform in mind as we were creating the application. But there's been a trend over the recent years, of course, to apps appearing on multiple platforms. And a perfect example of that would be Apple's approach to the idea of building a code base where you use Swift UI, for example, and Catalyst and that kind of approach, where you have this application that can potentially run on any number of platforms. For example, iPadOS, iOS, and macOS. And I think that requires us to think about how we approach the design, both visually and kind of on the business layer, differently. And I think there are a couple of advantages to doing it that way. Firstly, we have the mindset of, freeing ourselves to think about our interfaces being seen differently on different platforms. Maybe even on the same platform with different screen sizes, there's going to be differences. And taking those into account becomes a very kind of first-class citizen in our approach to how we lay out those designs and maybe how they adapt across platforms. But there's also a second part here that I think is just as important, and that's when it comes to a user's expectation. So as a user, I think, certainly for me, and I would suspect for many others, I expect my applications not only to work with the same or very similar features across platforms, assuming that my application is going to work across multiple platforms, but I also expect the data to be there. So data syncing between platforms also becomes a super important feature and a first-class citizen of the design, as it were. I think that, especially taking into account something like writing applications, right? If I'm working on a document on my iPad and then I go to my Mac, I expect it to be there from the cloud somehow for me to continue working on my Mac and vice versa. And then maybe later on I want to review it and make a few changes on my iPhone. And I just expect it to be there on those platforms available. And I think that that's how users see these things as well, right? Asking them to jump through some hoops to get their data there from exporting from one application to another and so on, it's just not reasonable to put upon a user. And certainly if you're competing with an application that has quote unquote seamless syncing, I think you're going to find that users will be using the application and not yours. And I get it. These things are very difficult. Data syncing is by no means easy. Apple and so many other platforms are doing a good job at trying to make it easier for us. Dropbox is another good example. Some people love OneDrive, for example, as well. Now, this is a very difficult challenge, but the one that we have to embrace, because this is a big thing now. And like I say, I feel like it's going to be just a standard expectation going forward from users. So I think we owe it to ourselves to start learning how to do that now and getting over the heartache and the pain of figuring it out and then just moving on, adding other features to our applications. So that's a few thoughts this week. This is based on a blog post that I put out there on peterwhittam.com, one of my websites. I'll put a link in the show notes if you're interested. But that's really what the article was about. And I felt it was important to share it with the CompileSwift podcast audience as well. So that's it this week. Let me know what you think. Reach out on Twitter at CompileSwift. You can go to CompileSwift.com as well, of course. Also CompileSwift on Instagram. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.